Now we're going to start adding forms to our web pages. I know that you know what a form is. It's a way that we can collect information from the user that they enter online. The tricky part about forms is not making the form or making the HTML in the form. It's figuring out what you're going to do after the user clicks the form to submit it. Oftentimes there'll be some sort of handler that will decide what to do with that information that comes from the form. Next week we're going to work with a PHP file that will pull the information from your form and then submit it to you via email. That's just one way that you can handle a form. You can have it saved to a server if that works as well for your organization's needs. However, this graphic shows the basic processing of a web form. You see the form on the client computer. Once they press submit, the form handler will deal with the form however it should. It may save it to a database and redirect it to a specific page based on answers from the form. And then that response page is sent back to the client's computer, which displays the response. Every form has a start form tag and a closing form tag, and those have to be inside the body tags. There are several attributes that you can set for the form. We do want to make sure that it has a unique ID so that we can refer to that specific form in our different attributes. The action attribute is typically a link to the file or what you want to happen after the form is press submitted. Next week we'll put our PHP file in there so that whenever that form is submitted, the PHP will take over and handle the action for the form. There are two different method attributes that will tell the browser how to submit the form information, and I'll talk about those in just a moment. Forms are created with the following code. We have a form, we have an ID, and this is all inside the opening form tag, method, and then an action, and then of course you can see the closing form tag. The example that I'm going to be using to look at this information is the family names project that is out in Blackboard, and you can take a look and open it up. I'm going to pull up my completed version so that we can look through the code and you don't have to watch me type. So here is the opening code for my family name form. The ID is called survey. It also has a name for survey. We've talked about both the ID and the name depending on the different browsers. The method is post, and we'll talk about that method here in a moment, and then the action. So once that submit button is pressed, this is the action it's going to run. In this case, it's going to run some JavaScript and it's going to run a method called submit form. Now I already have all of my form pieces inside of here, so I'm going to scroll down to the very bottom so that you can see my closing form tag. Right here on line 164. So these are all the elements that are inside my form that display within that survey form. Forms can have two different methods. One is called a get and one is called a post. The get method sends the data from the form by appending it to the URL. So it can be very messy and it's not a great way to hide information. The post method contacts the server from the browser, and then the server tells it how to handle that information. So we'll be using a PHP handler next week to pull the information from the form, and then we'll have that PHP send it to your email server. If you take Java 2 with me in the future, we'll be using Spring Framework, and Spring Framework will actually call a Java method to handle the form. It's pretty cool. Obviously, the post method is much more secure because you're having the server deal with how to send the information versus the get method where it just appends those parameters and attributes and whatever information they filled in to the form to the URL. So as you know, if you click inside of a URL inside of your browser, you can see that whole string that's in there. So not very secure. Let's start looking at the specific elements to add them to the form. First up is the text box. The text box is simply a box that the user can type text in. For our text box, we begin with an input type of text, and that is what will tell the browser to make a text box for the user to type in. We have a name and an ID. Both of them are the same first name so that we can pull the information from that text box. And then I've also put a class on here because we're going to format these text boxes to be certain colors. So this line 81 here will put a basic text box on the screen. There are other attributes that you can set with text boxes. You can use an initial value, and that's what the default data that will appear inside of that text box is, and we'll use that on an email coming up here in a moment. A size value, so what's the width of the box in the number of characters, and then a max value is the maximum number of characters that the user can type in the field. Now usually we use a field set element to organize our fields together so that like fields go inside of the same field set. If you look at my code, this first block here is a field set that I've made contact information. So I've opened up my field set, I've put a class in here because I'm going to adjust the labels to float to the left here in a minute. But here's the legend, and this is what appears up at the top of the field set. And then every field that is inside of this field set belong to the contact information field set. Your form may not be large enough where you have multiple field sets that you need to account for, but it is a great way to organize the information in chunks so that your user isn't overwhelmed with just line after line of data to fill in. So that field set translates to this group of fields over here. Right now I just have the first name from that we've discussed. We're going to look at the last name and the email address next. So in my code, I would go ahead and I would add in my input for the last name fields, and here's my default value that you saw filled in on the form. So now Sullivan is going to default inside of that last name box. Now they can click on it and change it. That's just the default text. And then finally, here's my last one down here. You can see it's a little bit different. I've used the type email, and I put in an email address. This just helps with validation. You can tell if there's no @ sign or if there's no dot by using that email type in the field. I also have put a size on that of 40, so it is a little bit longer than the other text boxes. I am going to come back and talk about these label tags in just a moment. They belong with the input type, and we actually group them together with the for tag that corresponds to the name and ID field that's for the input type. But first, before we do that, I want to talk a little bit about the form formatting so that yours can start looking like mine does. You can format the form container tags just as you would as any other kind of HTML elements. So I have created another CSS sheet called form style, and in this form style you can see that I've put the form up here. I've adjusted the margin, I put a border on it, put some padding on it, and font size around it too, so that everything will start appearing on that right hand side of the screen. I've also put in a form container div tag, which we haven't talked about yet, but we will start doing whenever we start working with layouts and stuff. This div tag called form container just gives me a way to float that form over to the right and control the width of it. You can see that I've used my labels, my label float left, to adjust the labels over to the left, and added some margin and color with it and text alignment. And I've also put in a field set tag that CSS that you can look at too to adjust the color. I have placed this code inside the PowerPoint so that you can also look at it there and add it to your specific CSS for your form. Let's talk about those labels. Without the labels, your users will have no idea what kind of information you're expecting them to put inside of the field. So we need to provide some sort of prompting text, and that's usually done with a label. So the input element is used to determine the type of data that it collects, while the label element will give a description of what is expected inside of that input element. So the two go hand in hand. The label element will use a for attribute, which gives the label an ID field that corresponds with the input element. There are some other attributes that you can also put inside of the type for determining the input type: text input, checkbox, option box, or another form element. We'll look at those in more detail coming up. We've already created one text box called first name, and our text boxes can contain letters or numbers or even symbols, but they are a single line of text. So again, this is what we were looking at earlier, where we've got the field set with the contact information, and inside of it we're holding a label and an input for first name, and we would go ahead and also create those for last name and email. An email is another input type that we can use to make a specific box, an email box. The default length and size makes it a little bit bigger. And here's the code for this. So here's the label for the email box. Notice that the name and ID matches the label for. The size we've made a little bit bigger. Class we'll deal with here in just a moment. And then the placeholder text is what appears by default inside of that box. So it won't stay there. Once the user starts typing, you can see it disappears. A little bit more information on using that field set class of the label float left to adjust the edges of the text boxes so that they're aligned. This code would go inside of our formstyle.css so that it would apply to all the classes that use the label float left class. So the value attribute is used to set an initial value of the text box. Notice that that is different from the placeholder. So if we look at the code, or if we look at the form, you can see that Sullivan is typed in here, and whenever I begin typing inside of this box, it will just append it to the end. Whereas with the placeholder attribute, it will start overwriting it. So those are the difference between the two. Let's look at these option buttons. They're often called radio buttons. Radio buttons have a group so that only one of them can be selected. If you need more than one thing to be selected, then you want to use checkboxes instead of radio buttons. Radio buttons let the users make a single choice from the group of options. The input type for all of the buttons are radio. Option buttons that form one group all have the same name, attribute, and value. And the value attribute is what is used whenever the form is submitted on the server. If you need to specify that a particular field is checked by default, you can use the checked attribute and value. So here's one example. Created another field set with personal information. We have an input type of radio and a name for gender, an ID, and a value, and then whether that's checked by default or not. And then the label for that particular checkbox, it will go after it, but it groups it together. So the for is using the same ID field name. When we look at all of them together, here they are. They all have the same input type of radio. They all have the same name of gender, but the ID and the value is what is changed. It corresponds to get that specific option to be registered as that option. So here's my label for male, and that corresponds with the ID and the value inside of the input type. Let's look at checkboxes next. Checkboxes allow users to choose none, one, or more of an item from a group. The input type is checkbox. The checkbox has a name that identifies the checkbox with a field in the database. The ID attribute is used for the label, and the data is the data that will be sent to the database if the checkbox is selected. To specify that the checkbox is selected by default, all you need to do is add the attribute checked and the value to set that particular checkbox as checked as by default. I have went ahead and put these checkboxes and labels inside of a field set class called group just for formatting, so that you can take out the margin and the border down to 0 so that they kind of shrink down closer. But that's the only reason that those are added. You don't need the field sets there if you're okay with the formatting. I just wanted to control it a little bit more. So you can see the input type is checkbox, the name interested, and all these names go together. And then the ID and the value match up. I use the ID in the label for, and then the inside of that label for is where the text goes that displays next to that checkbox. I have the first one checked by default, and that's just by using this checked attribute and value. Next up, let's look at this drop-down box here. This is called a selection list. It's a drop-down box where you can only select one item. You can only view one item at a time. And the select element is used to create a selection list. So a little bit different than what we've used so far. Options are the different choices that show inside of the selection list. Inside each of the options that are inside of our selection list, we have a value attribute, and that determines what is sent to the form handler. So all of our different options appear inside of an opening select tag and a closing select tag. So this name will go with all of these options inside of this drop-down list. Each option has its own opening and closing option tag, and then the text that should appear for the user to select is what will be in between those two tags. Here is the code for my drop-down list. Here's my label to begin it. It corresponds with the name of the select opening and closing select tags, and then here are my 4 options that appear. Each of them have a different value so that I can figure out which one was selected whenever I process the form. And then here is the code that displays as the drop-down option, and then here's the default. This one is selected by default on the form. You can modify selection lists so that more than one drop-down item appears. You can use the size and place a whole number in there and determine how many options you want to display in the selection list by default. You can allow the users to pick multiple ones by giving that attribute. And of course, the selected one that I showed you earlier is the default one that will show whenever the form is loaded. The last of our input fields for our forms that we'll look at is called the text area. The text area lets our user enter in more than one line of text information. It's often used for comments or maybe recipes, something that's going to be multiple lines that the user may need to put line breaks inside. The code for the text area is an opening text area and a closing text area tag. We have name, IDs, that shouldn't surprise you. You can also control how many rows are displayed and how many columns appear across. You can also control whether there's a scroll bar or along the side or along the bottom. You can also place default text in there if you would like. Any text that appears in between the text area tags will appear inside that text area whenever the page is loaded. It's a very nice way to get large chunks of information from your user. Now that we've got all these different form fields on our form, now what? We need some submit buttons. There are 2 types of buttons, command buttons. One is a submit and one is a reset. Let's talk about that reset button first. You can guess that whenever that button is pressed on that reset, that whatever's inside that form will reset. It'll cancel all the input and start over. The submit button type will allow the form to be submitted. So those different types will control what happens with the form. So we have two different types of buttons on our form. We have a submit and a reset. Here I have adjusted the text to be send information. I've also put a class on here so that I can adjust the different way that they display. The nice thing is with using an input type of reset, you don't have to put all the code in to actually go through and clear all of the form element, all of the input out of the form element. The reset button will take care of it for you. When we created our form, we told our form that whenever the button was submitted, that it should post this information using the JavaScript submit form method that was created. So whenever we load our form and hit submit, this message should pop up that tells you what's all inside of each of the field names. And you can just press OK to get it to go away. This form doesn't actually submit anything, but it does let us see that we're getting information from the form and what might be submitted with it. So this week, work with creating your forms, setting them up so that they look nice and presentable. And next week, we'll put on our PHP handler so that once we pull the information out of our form, it will send the information to us via email.